Welcome into today's edition of the Sports Hub Patriots podcast for Training Camp Day 7. I'm Alex Barth, coming to you after what was a very eventful day at Patriots Training Camp. And joining us to help go through it is Chris Mason from Mass Live. Chris, thanks for joining the show.
You got it, man. Thanks for choosing me for the most entertaining practice of the summer. Plenty to talk about.
It really is. Like, all of a sudden, it just broke out. It felt like the offense today flipped a switch, started moving the ball. I saw Andrew Callahan had this tweet, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, but it's an interesting way to look at it. That was their best offensive practice in 2 years. That might be the best the offense has looked in 2 years. He went back to that August training camp practice against the Giants, the one where Cam Newton was suspended or away from the team or whatever you want to call it, and Mac took over the starting job, and he lit up the Giants. And I think you saw some of that today. Is that as good, do you think, Mac Jones has looked since the end of his rookie season?
Yeah, and that practice against the Giants is a really good one to pick out, where he was, like 38 of 40 there and just like he's throwing darts. That was the day that quarterback competition with Cam Newton really changed. But today, I think, is the day they really needed, where the last couple of days, people have been, kind of on the offense, like, well, they look better. They look better. It's like, yeah, I mean, the bar was so low to start because, you had them in the red zone for 3 days in a row against a defense that's probably more talented and is definitely more together based on how veteran they are and everything. They were just further ahead. So the first 3 days at camp, you're kind of like, the bar is set so low for the offense that then they start doing a little better. You're like, oh, they're improving. But today was the day that it was like against anything, not just this year, going back a ways. Like, they really had the entire operation moving. It looked streamlined, and Bill O'Brien's fingerprints are so obviously like on this offense, and it's made a huge difference.
It's interesting you mentioned the word streamlined, because that's what it feels like. It feels like everybody's moving in the same direction again. We haven't felt that in a while, especially Mac and the wide receivers. The throw to Juju Smith-Schuster. So this was late in practice. They were in red zone. Juju runs. It was tough to tell if it was a slant or an in cut along the back of the end zone. Corner's right there with him. So Mac Jones elevates the ball a little bit. Juju goes up and gets it, taps the feet for the touchdown. That's a timing play. That's a chemistry play. And for two guys that have been on the field together for a week now, that's it, because Juju wasn't on the field in the spring. Those are the kind of things that you look at and you say, all right, this is true progress. This isn't, oh, they just went out and today wasn't as bad as yesterday, which I feel like got defined as progress sometimes last year. But this is what an NFL offense looks like as it builds up in training camp.
In that play too, specifically, Jones at the line of scrimmage audibled. He saw something in the defense and they're letting him audible already. He did that and they had that connection right there. So I think it's another, like, they're moving along here. It's what you want to see at this point.
The other really interesting thing from the offense, I thought, today as a whole was, well, look, the last few days I've come on it. Ironically, we were talking about it right before we started recording, but it didn't come up right away on the show, is the offensive line and how that's been a hindrance and that's gotten in the way. Didn't really feel that today. I don't know that it's because the offensive line played great, and we can get into some of the one-on-one stuff we saw, but they're using concepts that work around that. They're getting the ball out of Mac's hands quick. We saw a couple plays where he rolled out and threw the ball in order to kind of buy himself a little more time. And that's the first few days they're installing very vanilla stuff, and that's what's expected. That's what every team does every year. You're starting to see them kind of ramp it up a little more and get into some more complex, more unique designs. And it seems like this is what they're going to do about this offensive line. A lot of people have asked, how can they go into the season with these tackles? How can they expect this to work? And I think you're seeing the answer to that, which is basically get the ball out of Mac's hands quick and get him out of harm's way.
Yeah, and I do think that the line's still going to be an issue to some degree, but philosophically, it's just like, okay, now you have a coordinator who sees the line is an issue, and, the quick game didn't suck. The quick game doesn't suck right now. The quick game is actually being called effectively and it's working. And I mean, that's obviously night and day.
The thing about the quick game for me that's going to get interesting, and this was one of the things that we saw from the offense today that maybe wasn't as optimistic, was Tyquan Thornton was limited. He really didn't practice after a rough start to camp. And the thing about the quick game is you need guys who can contribute after the catch. And we know Juju can do that. We know Kendrick Bourne can do that. Not as much Devontae Parker's game, but you don't need everybody to do it. But Demario Douglas, another big day today, another guy that stood out, that's continued to stand out. And when it comes to the quick game, like, he's a guy you think needs to be on the field. And I didn't love the camp that Tyquan was having at this point. I still don't, but I'd kind of been in the mindset of, all right, He was the 50th overall pick 2 years ago. He's their only hope to get speed on the field, really, on the offensive side of the ball. They're going to give him some wiggle room, but a rough start. He's now hurt essentially for the second time in the preseason process, or limited for the second time in the preseason process. He was hurt in the spring, missed some time in the spring. And you have this other fast receiver in Demario Douglas who's starting to emerge. It's going to be interesting to see the way that plays out, because it felt like it was Thornton and Bourne competing for that third wide receiver role, but maybe now Demario Douglas is starting to enter that conversation.
Yeah, I don't think it's terribly hyperbolic to say that Thornton's camp couldn't be getting off to a worse start. We're practice 7 here?
Yeah.
Now he's hurt, but in the first 6, even when he was a full participant, there's one day that he was catching passes. Other than that, there was nothing in team drills. He hasn't been impressive just really in any area right now. And, missed minicamp too, had an issue there. They're like, it's got to happen at some point. It's just not happening yet.
What'd you make? And we even talked to him in a few days, but we talked to him, I think it was on day 3 of camp, where he was catch list to that point, and this was starting to kind of become a story. And he said, I'm just out there. There's things I can work on, whether I'm getting the ball or not. He wasn't worried about the lack of targets. What'd you make of his approach to kind of his struggles? Because I think a guy like this, we hear so many guys that struggle early and get discouraged, and you don't want that to happen, obviously, to anybody, but a guy that was picked high and is crucial to the team, and it seems like has honestly tried to put the work in. What'd you make of his approach to his struggles early on?
I thought some of that was just the cliche stuff that you're going to get. Kendrick Bourne said something similar a day later, right, when he also wasn't really making an impact. So I didn't read too deeply into that stuff. With him, it's just going to be seeing is believing. Like once you see it happen, and once you see him do it repeatedly, that's the thing. And it's really discouraging to see him not out there when they're in pads now, because I think that's the biggest test for him, right? When they're in shorts and t-shirts, he can run, he can, it's the OTA superstar, which is great. And you want those skills, but at some point it has to translate to, the real thing. And we still haven't seen it. It's still early. He's got time, but it's not a good start.
So where are you at? Because now we're at this interesting point. I think it was the wide receivers as a whole, the first 4 or 5 days of camp they're not good enough. But now you're starting to see Juju make plays. You're starting to see Devontae Parker make plays. Are you any more encouraged about the wide receiver group as a whole over the last few days? Or do you think this is just, as weird as it sounds to say, given everything we've been through in the last year, do you think this is the quarterbacks, Mac Jones, and Bailey Zappi's made some nice throws too. He made the throw of the day today to Trey Nixon, 40-yard go ball down the field. Do you think this is the quarterbacks maybe starting to elevate the wide receivers like we were saying they need to, or do you just think the wide receivers are maybe finding their groove?
I think it's a little bit of the supporting cast around them helping to find their groove. When you have Hunter Henry cooking the way that he has in this camp, I think that opens more things up, Jasicki's finally starting to get involved today too. I was going to say Ramondre when he's out there, that's a whole other thing. But when he's out there, again, that's another supporting piece that really can open some stuff up for the wide receivers. And I think that's philosophically how they're going to look at this offense. It's not like how good are our 5 wide receivers. It's all right, who are the 5 guys that are going to be out there? And you're including, your 2 tight ends in there and your running back. And you don't really need 5 elite wide receivers is I think the philosophy there.
So to build on kind of the day they had, and we touched on it before, the one-on-ones, you saw dominant wins today from Kendrick Bourne. You saw really good reps from Mario Douglas. Devontae Parker had some. And then on the offensive line as well, Antonio Mafi, felt like these key guys that we think either we know are key, or like a guy like Mafi with Cole Strange and Mike Onwenu banged up. It seems like he's the next guard up, might be key. Anything specific stand out to you during one-on-ones?
Well, first of all, just watching them, it was felt like there's maybe 1.5 starting offensive linemen that are actually going to be out there, or that they hope is going to be out there when the season starts, in David Andrews. And I thought he was by far the steadiest, as you'd expect. One of the high profile matchups down there was him against Christian Barmore. And, Barmore tried a swim move. Andrews was so ready for it, just used his leverage against him and so nonchalantly just pushed him out of the pocket. And it was yeah, that's what you're looking for there. The other spots, you want guys to come back at a certain point, right? You'd like Trent Brown to practice. I understand that they're managing him. You hope that you get your 2 guards back, but it was just the striking thing watching it was just, how backup filled it was, and how, it didn't look like there were a ton of guys that are going to be out there on the offensive line. And defensively, Keon White really caught my eye. He absolutely blew past Connor McDermott on one rep on the edge too, which like he took his first rep was inside and it was against, I think, Jake Andrews. And it was one of those ones, it was a little bit stalematey. It was tough to tell who won, but then they kicked him outside. And for him to already have that versatility where you're doing both and to make a tackle, like an NFL tackle, look foolish like he did, it was impressive. And I think that's one thing that like early in camp, the rookies that we've heard so much about are Demario Douglas, Marte Mapu.
Yep.
And it's because they haven't had pads on, like once you get pads on, you can see what Keon White can do. And he was impressive today. He sacked Bailey Zappi in 11s too. It's a good day for him.
Yeah, I was really excited to see that because this is a guy, exactly like you said, I was ready to write about him. I was ready to kind of watch him and spotlight him. And it just, a guy like that in non-padded practices, there's really not much going on. But this is a guy that's so physically dominant, so athletically dominant. And when you look at the defense they've built with the speed of Josh Uche, the motor of a guy like Matthew Judon, Christian Barmore's quickness, these guys that just kind of have all these different carrying traits across that line, across that defensive front into the second level, and you can kind of mix and match and pick matchups. Keon White feels like another guy that's going to be a really fun matchup guy, just with his strength. And I think the fact that he went against Connor McDermott specifically, you make a good point for a rookie against a guy that's been in the league as long as McDermott have. I mean, this is a guy, he might not be the most talented, but he's seen everything at this point. And to get him on his heels the way Keon White did is big. But I also just think for him, he's a guy that's going to win with size and power. And Connor McDermott's a guy that's going to win with size and power. So it's not like just because he's the first name that comes to mind when I think of smaller, more, agile offensive lineman, Isaiah Wynn, I would expect Keon White to bowl over a guy like Isaiah Wynn. Connor McDermott's 6'8", 320. That's not a guy you're bowling over and taking that lightly. So really exciting to see him kind of step up. And it's a crowded defensive line room, between Guy, Wise, Barmore, Godshaw. Like he's going to have to win some reps. And you bring up a good point. I thought he went a good ways in doing that today.
Yeah, and it's also interesting with him too, where he's listed at 290, and you watch his tape, and he's definitely powerful. But you're like, is this guy actually like 290 with the way he can move? And I walked in behind him today, like he was coming through the tunnel as I was walking up to the media tent. And it was like, oh, he's absolutely 290. This guy is huge, but he moves like someone he's like a little too quick for that weight. You know what I mean? Where it's like, wow, you've got a matchup piece here.
I mean, he's one of those guys too. It's his background's really interesting, and that's part of what makes him an interesting player. Former tight end, and was recruited as a tight end to Old Dominion, and then changed positions before transferring to Georgia Tech, and then goes to Georgia Tech. But this is, I feel like when we go through the draft, we don't need to do too much draft talk right now. God knows I get enough of that, but there's that like, typical Patriot, change position, five tech, whatever. But sometimes those typical Patriot blueprint guys kind of work. And it feels like Keon White is a guy who can be a typical Patriot draft pick, but also sort of be what they need on that defensive line, especially, Lawrence Guy's back out there, but who knows what his future is.
Right. And you're definitely looking at the long term there too, where, I think Guy has 2 years left on his deal, but I don't know if he retired next offseason, I don't think anyone would be shocked. So you're planning for the future there. But to have a guy that can really play all over the defensive line would be huge.
So we've brought it up kind of in passing a few times. Ramondre Stevenson was limited again today. Trent Brown was limited. Matthew Judon was limited. Maybe Judon's is different. There's been rumblings that he's not happy with his contract. That's also a guy of those three. He can put the helmet on week 1 and go. I don't think anybody should be super worried about him missing time. But we asked, Trent Brown spoke once early in camp, but he hadn't really been doing the limited workload yet. We got to speak to Ramondre Stevenson today and ask him why he's been limited. He said you'd have to ask Bill. And then he actually told Zolak and Bertrand immediately after that in his interview with them that it is the coaching staff that has him limited. And there's been some reports that that's the case with Trent Brown as well, that this is the coaching staff. This is a new approach for them. They've never been about, oh yeah, it's just camp, take it easy, you'll be ready for the regular season. Are you surprised at all that they're doing kind of workload work with certain guys? Are you surprised it's these guys? And just what do you make of them trying to move forward without them out there?
I am a little surprised just because in the past you've seen it done quietly, but it was like Dev McCourty, Julian Edelman, guys that are getting up there. Edelman was dealing with a knee injury and he was getting days off. Dev was just, he'd tell you he was old. He's getting days off. And so, Trent and Ramondre both don't really fall into that category. But I think it does make sense philosophically when you think about how important the two of them are to the offense. At the end of the day, pound
Yeah.
for pound, Ramondre is probably still the best player on that offense. And he was worn down at the end of last year, and they just don't have depth behind him, which that's an issue they could address. But as it stands right now, like, you don't want that guy getting hit in training camp for no reason. And with Trent, I feel like that one's a little different just because he's not coming off his best year. He really isn't. And you think at some point you need more reps, you need, to really get in the rhythm. But if they're happy with how he came into camp and are just keeping him in bubble wrap for a little while, I mean, I get that. I do think it's kind of funny though that like the whole thing with DeAndre Hopkins was, he wouldn't fit into New England because he doesn't practice. It's just not going to work. And now you have 3 of the top 5 best players on the team aren't practicing.
That's actually a really good point. I haven't heard it spun that way yet. That's and some people thought that's why they didn't offer him, that next level of money to match Tennessee was, he's not going to mesh culturally. He's not going to practice. That's a guy they probably would have given maintenance days to had he come here.
Right.
The Trent Brown one to me is really interesting. And today, maybe we saw this concept kind of go to the side, but the last few days, the way the offensive line had been, and look, the offense was decent yesterday, but there were still both quarterbacks multiple times throwing off the back foot just because the pressure was there. The one thing I wonder with Trent Brown is if the other offensive linemen are really struggling. This is kind of where things started to go wrong last year. There were issues up front and they couldn't get any of their plays in. They couldn't run any of their plays because there was just never time. If the offensive line can't hold up, does Trent Brown need to come back in? Not for Trent Brown's sake, but for everybody else's sake, so that they actually have things blocked so they can run the reps. Again, the way it worked today, they were able to run everything fine with like their third string offensive line. Really just, it's not even first and third string anymore, but like it's just one group. But it is something I wonder, like, how long can they get on without Trent Brown before maybe that becomes a problem? It's just, hey, we just need you out there because we need the body.
Well, it's interesting from like a human perspective too. I think a lot of that is how well is the defense actually going to listen when it's like, stay off the quarterback, don't mess with the quarterback. They're not going to hit him, but they can get in his way. They can affect his throw. They can do that. And like the offense had a really good day today. They let the defense hear it. They were chirping so loud all the practice. Like they come back tomorrow and are in pads again. Maybe you happen to step in front of one of those passes and maybe, you want to let the offense know that, hey, we're here. Like that would have been a sack, yada, yada, yada. So I think like, as long as the defense keeps listening, I don't think it'll be a huge issue. But at a certain point, the human element takes over and you're like, okay.
We did see late in practice, Miles Bryant kind of thumped Pierre Strong. It wasn't a full-on tackle. Actually, there was a full-on tackle. I'm trying to remember. It was 2 of the third stringers. I think it was Brad Hawkins.
I think it was Rodney Randall.
And was it okay? So I didn't remember if it was 29 or 39. 39.
Yeah, it was Rodney Randall and Pop Douglas because Troy Brown was not happy. He came off the sideline and kind of gave him an earful there for doing that. But yeah, that was like a full speed collision. That was like, that's not supposed to happen right now.
Yeah. In which fair. And honestly, it's probably not the worst thing in the world for Demario Douglas to get hit a little bit at this point because contact's a big question for him. But, you had the first day of pads, the defense kind of had to get a talking to because players were getting hurt. And then you started to see some contact bubble over later in practice today. I think that's a really good point about the human element, and you've got guys on that defense, Jabril Peppers, Juwan Bentley. They're not going to take it well if the direction from the coaches is, let the offense have a couple. I don't think those are guys that are going to let that go. And you don't want them to let that go. Like, that's good. You don't want them to have that mentality. You want them to be even in camp trying to win. But it did feel like at times last year, like straight up, it was the defense was just taking plays off to let the offense try to get some things run. I don't think we're at that point this year, but would it have to get to that point, right, for them to be like, all right, Trent, you got to come up. You got to practice. We need you.
Right. And I mean, last year was just such a different animal where they were trying to put the zone run in and it was like every single one just wasn't like they need 11 guys on the same page. And without fail, there would be at least one offensive player that was not on the same page. It would get blown up. And it really was slow to a crawl. Whereas like, okay, we're going to do this way. It looks so bad.
So we've talked a lot about the first team offense, and I do want to touch on Bailey Zappi really quickly because I thought he had a good day. He had the throw of the day, hit Trey Nixon, but in the context of the offensive line, this is kind of to the same conversation. I know I heard on my station, on our station 98.5, talking about Zappi maybe with the ones, and that happening early in practice. They're at the point where there is no first and second team offensive line. There's 5 guys because that's all they have. And
Right.
it's Mac Jones lining up behind them and then Bailey Zappi lining up behind them. I did think Bailey, like I've been trying to throughout this camp. I almost feel bad for Bailey Zappi because he's only talked about as the other option, right? Mac Jones wasn't good. Time for Bailey Zappi. Or Mac Jones is good. Like, we don't need to talk about Bailey Zappi. In a bubble, I thought Bailey Zappi had a good day today. I thought he was throwing the ball well. I thought this was one of his best days of camp because he was clearly pushing himself early on. And now it feels like he's starting to let the game come to him a little more.
I agree with that. And I do think that he's playing a little freer now, where even the last few days, he has not been afraid to take shots down the field. You know, he's kind of, it's loose. And I mean, the balls have been dimes, you know, he's been I think the throw to Trey Nixon today was the longest completion of camp thus far. It was a great ball. So I think he is a little freer, but I mean, he just looks kind of like you'd expect a second year, fourth round quarterback to look, where he has some great throws and there's still some like shorter touch passes that, you know, need some work. So I think he's where you expect him to be, but yeah, you're definitely spot on with the always the other option. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Big day too for the rookies. I know we've already touched on some of them. Demario Douglas made some plays today. Antonio Mafi got in the mix. Any specific rookie stand out to you today?
Oh, Kayshon Boutte for sure. I think today was a big day for him. You know, when Tyquan Thornton goes down to the rehab field, suddenly Boutte gets some reps with the ones for the first time, and he catches his first pass from Mac Jones in camp. You know, look good in the one-on-one periods too. This is what you want to see from him, is just building a little momentum, because he had none to start camp. And, you know, today was easily his best day of the summer.
And he's a guy that he's an interesting case. There's a ton of natural talent there. Was the consensus number one receiver in this draft class less than a year ago, and then just had a really bad year at LSU. But he's a guy that it feels like it could snowball with him in a good way. Like if he gets going, it's going to get very interesting because he's a top 100 talent. He had some, you know, character concerns coming into the draft, and then it sounded like, based on what he told us, he did the combine with a broken ankle, which is a choice. I don't know that I would have advised him to do that, but the talent's there when you watch him on film. So if he gets going, like, I know we're all getting excited about Demario Douglas, and I get that, but I as much as I like Demario Douglas as a player, and I think he gives them something they need, he does kind of a ceiling as well. You know, he's 5'8", he's on the smaller side. Kayshon Boutte's the guy that I'm really not sure what to make of him, but if he gets going, that's a guy that I'll let myself get really excited about, because I mean, I saw it on tape. I saw it at LSU. I know how good he can be. Whether or not he gets there is the question.
Right. And when he was just randomly missing from, was it Sunday's practice? It's like, okay, what's going on here? Is this going to be a Foxborough flu type thing? Like, where are we at? But then, you know, he comes out here today, finally really gets an opportunity and runs with it. You can't ask for much more than what he delivered.
And then one rookie I thought had a really interesting day today. We've talked about all the rookies that were good today. Christian Gonzalez had a super interesting day. He was shadowing Devontae Parker pretty much throughout the day, 1-on-1s, 11-on-11s, and you know, their one-on-one rep, it was the last one-on-one rep of that session, and Gonzalez made him work for it. I mean, like, hung through 2-3 cuts. Eventually, Parker broke to the sideline, gave Mac Jones a small window. Mac Jones hit it. So Gonzalez loses that one-on-one, but I'm not sure what more he could have done. Later on in team drills, I thought he was tight on Parker. Parker just gets him, you know, goes up, gets the ball over him. Maybe a little bit of OPI there. So
I think there's I think there's a lot of OPI there. I think, you know, Gonzalez isn't calling for it because he's a rookie, but I was watching through the binoculars. There was a pretty strong two-hand push from Parker that I think should have drawn a flag, but no refs this time of year. It's gonna stand.
Well, I think that kind of even gets further to the point. I look at a day like that, because I can't say he was bad today, because it seemed like he did everything he needed to do, but sometimes that's football. You do everything you need to do, and the other guy just makes one more play than you do. I'm kind of looking at, like, today felt like a real welcome to the NFL moment for him. You know, he did everything right, and it still didn't go his way. How does he come out and respond tomorrow? What'd you make of his day today?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. But I think the best thing that you can say about his camp thus far is that, I don't know if you feel this way, but I think it's pretty obvious that their three best cornerback alignment is Christian Gonzalez and Jack Jones on the boundary, and then John Jones in the slot, which is a giant question mark just because of Jack Jones and what's going to happen there. But the fact that Christian Gonzalez is kind of like the afterthought there, was like, oh yeah, he's playing really well. He's definitely like your starter on the boundary. As a kid a week into his first camp, really speaks to, just kind of the professionalism, I think you would say he's come in with, or the polish, whatever you want to call it. But he just, he looks like he belongs.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Those three corners, I know people want to get excited about Marcus Jones. He's kind of had a so-so camp. He's been up and down, but those three corners, that's their best group, far and away. I don't. It drops off after that. You get down to Miles Bryant and then some kind of bottom of the roster, maybe not guys, but we'll see if they go with that group. They've been rotating in and out a lot, but when it's those three on the field, you kind of stop and watch because that's when you really see, I think, the ceiling of this defense.
Definitely. And Marcus Jones is at a really interesting camp where it feels like they've thrown him to the wolves a little bit, where he's on Parker all the time. And
Yeah.
obviously there's that size difference, and you would think Marcus Jones slot guy, but they clearly want to push him and see what he can do. And as you'd expect, he has some like good reps with those and some bad reps with those. And that's just going to that's part of it.
It does feel like a few things they've done, rotating that secondary as much as they have, playing Miles Bryant on the boundary as much as they have, elevating Isaiah Bolden's role. It feels like they're preparing for potentially not having Jack Jones. And I think it's notable, the report today from New Orleans that Alvin Kamara is expected to be suspended. It's not apples to apples, his case and Jack Jones, obviously, but kind of similar type situations in terms of, adjacent to football. And I wonder if that's something they're preparing for, that Marcus Jones could be that second boundary guy if they're going to keep Jonathan Jones in the slot. Maybe they're not comfortable with where Isaiah Bolden's at or where Amir Speed's at.
Yeah, it definitely could be. And even the Gonzalez draft pick almost feels like a Jones contingency plan there, where it's like, we don't know if we can rely on this guy. So we're taking a corner in the first round who's going to play on the boundary, and he's going to give them more insurance there. Right.
Right. One more thing I want to ask you about before we wrap it up and look ahead. And this isn't camp related, but you wrote a piece up today or yesterday, today on Mass Live. You talked to Art Rooney about Robert Kraft's Hall of Fame candidacy. I think the whole thing's fascinating. I think it's 16 owners in the NFL, and that I'm not counting guys that were like league founders that also owned a team. I mean, just bought in owners like Kraft is. Only a handful of guys, less than 10, have gotten in while owning the team. The most recent was Jerry Jones. I long said, like, if Jerry Jones is in, I get it, but Robert Kraft should have gotten in before him. But Terrell Owens should have gotten in before Marvin Harrison as well. So the Hall is the Hall. But what'd you gain from that conversation with Rooney and maybe where Kraft's chances stand as he's a finalist here?
So it's really interesting that for the coach contributor category, the voters are really looking for okay, the winning's obviously there, right? You're never going to dispute 6 Lombardi trophies. That's huge.
Right.
But it's also the impact on the game of football. And that's what they look at is how have you impacted the league and how have you impacted the game? And one of the biggest, notches on Kraft's resume is the 2011 lockout. And essentially Jeff Saturday at the time said he saved football. He's the man that, helped save football. And so it was interesting talking to Rooney, who was in the room for all those meetings, who was like, yeah, Robert was huge there. He was a key player. We really needed him to open that dialogue. Because I think there's a tendency among owners to some degree to want to take credit for, everything, where it's every TV deal, every CBA, everyone wants their credit for it. But we have another owner in Rooney who's saying yeah, what Robert did there was massive for us. I think that's pretty insightful to get that behind the scenes look from an owner's perspective.
That's the quote I always go back to too, when talking about his candidacy, the man who saved football. And you remember too, that was right after Myra passed, right after his wife passed. He goes back. He kind of took care of business, and he's been instrumental in some of the TV deals and stuff since. But it's going to be really interesting to see, because it's a big class, that senior committee, and there are. Yeah. I'm not going to say that the rest of the class isn't deserving. I think there are certainly deserving names, but again, the man that saved football, you would think, should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You would think.
And there's more on his resume too, outside the game, where beyond the wins, where keeping the Patriots in New England was huge when he did that. The TV deals that you brought up are also a big check on his resume, where he is very involved in those committees. The funniest thing that Rooney said in that conversation I had with him was that Robert's very active. He's like, we have some owners in this league that don't even come to meetings, but Robert is there. Robert's on these committees. He wants to be involved. He wants to do everything, and he has the league's best interest in mind. He wants to elevate things. He wants to keep ascending. And I mean, getting that perspective from him was great, because it's okay, you've been competing for 20 years, but you clearly have a lot of respect here. So it was a good chat.
It's funny. I think what part of the reason, if I were campaigning for Kraft, and you're a baseball guy, you'll appreciate this, during the MLB lockout last spring, so spring 2022, I remember when it was getting late, I wrote a column, basically baseball needs a Robert Kraft, because I don't know that there's any owners in baseball that are baseball fans. And you're starting to see less and less owners in sports as a whole that are fan. And like, I don't know from a business standpoint, maybe like abstractly a lockout or something makes sense in theory, but you have to play the games at the end of the day. And I feel like it takes a little bit of fan to push that across. And I think Robert Kraft has done a very good job of balancing, right? We know history. He's a Patriots fan. He was a season ticket holder since the 70s. You get that little bit of like, I think he's still very grounded to what it means to own a pro sports team versus some other owners, maybe some other owners in Boston that essentially see it as a latent income stream, a passive income stream and nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he's on the team for 29 years now. And you can tell he's still just so involved because he's a fan. He loves the game, and it's kind of funny that talking about the Boston owners, there's like a couple different ones you could have been referring to as ones that just care about the bottom line and don't actually care about the product. Not sure which. Were you going Jacobs or John Henry?
I was going John Henry because I mean he's on the mind with the deadline yesterday, right? But
yeah,
it's kind of a dichotomy of the owners here in Boston. All right, he is Chris Mason. He covers the Patriots for Mass Live. Chris, before we let you go here, what are you looking for tomorrow? At kind of the end of the stretch, 6 days of practice in a row. The in-stadium on Friday is kind of its own, low-key thing. What are you looking for here the last full day of pads before a few days off?
I was gonna say, I'm really just hoping they're in full pads again, like after 2 days of full pads. I assume they're going to be walking through in the stadium. Could have shells tomorrow, but man, I just want to see more full pads. I want to see one-on-ones. You learn so much. Like this is probably where we learn the most about the team the entire year, right? Getting to watch entire practices, getting to see these matchups that you wouldn't see anywhere else. So yeah, man, I'm just hoping they're in pads again. Everything else is gravy.
He is Chris Mason from Mass Live. You can follow him on Twitter @byChrisMason. Chris, thanks for joining us today.
You got it, Alex. Thanks for having me.
And I'll be back tomorrow, another Sports Hub Patriots podcast training camp show. Until then, check out 98.5thesportshub.com and follow the Sports Hub YouTube channel. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.